Welcome to Exploring A Course in Miracles. I'm Emily Bennington here with Robert Perry, and today we are talking about a captivating theme that runs throughout the course, and it's the idea that either God is insane or the world is. And the course presents this as a choice as stark as that and says repeatedly that we must decide which value system we are going to believe in, God's or the world's. I should mention that this podcast is loosely based on a section of the course in the CE. It's chapter 25, section 7, entitled God is Not Insane. Robert, it is nice to be with you again, as always.
Yeah, great to be here. I'm looking forward to this.
Yeah. So, where would you like to start with this? We did a course companions class this week on this topic, and it really resonated, didn't it?
It did. I mean, you and I connected with the material on a deep level, and it felt like everyone in the class was connecting with it too.
Yeah. So, let's get into it.
Okay. So, what this section does over the whole course of it is to lay out this contrast between these two worlds. Okay. There's what it calls the world, and it says the world is based on sin. Now, sin is not a popular word these days, but I think we have a sense of the idea. And the section then goes on to sort of unpack the idea and define the idea of sin as the basis of the world in this way. It says, "For in this world, it seems that one must gain because another loses." And then it says that this is, quote, "a form of the more basic tenet, sin is real and rules the world." So a world based on sin, according to this section, is a world in which everyone's trying to gain because another loses. And, obviously that includes trying to gain from someone else's loss, trying to cause their loss so that you can gain. And if the whole world is doing that, then it is an apt description to say that it's founded on sin.
Reminds me of our specialness podcast that we did recently, where everyone's trying to have their own sharp elbows to make their way to the top.
Yeah, it's a really good connection. In fact, in chapter 24, the course says that specialness is the roots and sin is the flower that comes from those evil roots. So specialness is the source of sin.
So, what's on the other side of sin? What is the other choice that we have?
So the other side is another world. There's no title for it in this section. You could say it's the Holy Spirit's world. And it's based on love. Its whole foundation is an opposite foundation. And love is described in the same terms in terms of gaining and losing. So here's a line from later in the section. Salvation is rebirth of the idea no one can lose for anyone to gain, and everyone must gain if anyone would be a gainer. So we can boil that down very simply to love means we gain together, right? If you lose, I lose. If you gain, I gain.
Yeah. And so, when we think about this contrast, really in the course says that there ultimately is no sin. And so, it's referring to something without reality. And so, um, that's part of what should make our decision easier, right? Like we're choosing between something that is real and unreal. And so it should make the decision between these two value systems simple.
That's true. And the section does say a number of things along those lines. It says that sin is not real. It says that sin as a foundation for the world seems immutable, like you can never change it. The world will always rest on, people contending with each other for private gain. But it is changeable because God did not create it. And it says that sin is not our real will. What we really want, our truly native desires are for love. We just think we desire personal gain at the expense of others. So yeah, that's all in the section. But I think that what for our purposes is so essential is just to kind of get on a visceral level that contrast. You've got the world as we know it, based on sin, based on the attempt on the part of each individual to gain from the loss of others. And you have another world, a world based on love, where part of love is the understanding that we gain together.
Yeah, and they're mutually exclusive, right? You're in one place or you're in the other. And what we try and do is marry them in some way. So we believe in the world and we believe in love, and that tension in our mind is what's sort of spilling out into erratic behaviors, as I was talking about in the class. It's like we can't get clear in our own thinking about this, what is real and what isn't. And so our fuzzy thinking spills over into just insane behaviors.
Yeah, we can't get clear. And I do think our mind is kind of spread out with pieces of our mind in each of the worlds. But what the section stresses over and over again is that in principle, they are completely irreconcilable. You can't marry them, you can't mush them together. And the way the section puts it is that each world sees the other as insane. And I want to read a passage about that. He says that what is not love is sin, and either one, love or sin, perceives the other as insane and meaningless. Love is the basis for a world perceived as wholly mad to sinners who believes theirs is the way to sanity. But sin is equally insane within the sight of love, whose gentle eyes would look beyond the madness and rest peacefully on truth. And what that captures for me is a very real thing in the world where when you're in that place of this is how the world works, you know, you have to be somewhat aggressive. You have to look out for
Get your
number
piece
one,
of the pie.
have to get your piece of the pie, go for the
Mhm.
brass ring. And when you're in that frame of mind, the idea of just being loving so that you stand for everyone's gain, that seems not just reckless, it seems insane.
Yeah, and all of the messaging that, and again, this is where it feels tied to our specialness podcast, all of the messaging that we get is completely the antithesis of what this section is saying. Because the messaging that we get is go for that brass ring, go get it, achieve your goals. And so the messaging that we're getting isn't so connected to this choice of love. I mean, who's saying, as you climb the ladder, bring everyone with you? Some people are, but it's
Yeah.
certainly not the primary cultural message that we're receiving.
Well, there's a reason why the course calls that one side the world, right? The messages you're talking about are the world's messages. And this section's saying it's an insane world. I think too that one of the things that happens is we get messages about the other side, about the Holy Spirit's world, and what they say is that's the ideal, that's what it means to be good. And yes, try to get there, but make sure you tie your camel. The messages aren't saying that is actual sanity. It's
Mm-hmm.
saying, you can say something's an ideal and that it's good without saying that's sanity and the other is insane.
Yeah, and I love the quote that you just read. And there's another one in that same section that says, and nothing that the world believes as true has any meaning in his mind at all.
God's
So,
mind, yeah.
God's mind, yeah. So, nothing that we believe is true here has any meaning in his mind at all. So, you think about all the things that we value, all of this, the trappings of specialness, all of our health, our relationships, our house, our cars, our families, all that stuff has has no meaning in his mind at all. That's an extraordinary thing. Everything we value here means nothing to him.
Yeah, and I think, the course talks about God or the Holy Spirit even supplying us with the things we need along the way, even as illusory as they are. But ultimately, what that passage you just read is about is the the thoughts and the values that we hold in the world have no meaning. So on the one side, in from the world standpoint, we think, yep, this is sanity. You got to go for the brass ring, right? Nice guys finish last. And then we look at love just being loving and standing for everyone's gain and think that's kind of insane. But then we have to realize that the reverse is true. Love looks at the world and says, all that contending with other egos for personal gain at the expense of the other guy, that's not tempting even. It's actually insane. And sanity is love.
And I'm tempted to ask, well, what does that look like in the world? How can we get there? But we have a model in Jesus,
Right.
don't
We
we?
have a model, and that I think that model is something we really can focus on to get a sense of these two sides and even how they see each other. And I wanted to read this quote from Houston Smith. This is from his classic book. It was The Religions of Man. It then became updated and became The World's Religions. But he's talking about the teachings of Jesus, and especially as we find them in the Sermon on the Mount. And I think those teachings are largely from him. And scholars take those more seriously than some of the other teachings in the Gospels. And he's got a long passage here. I just want to read some selected parts of it, but you really get a sense. It's a great passage. And Houston Smith was such a great writer. You get a sense of the clash between these two worlds. Okay, so what he says is this: we are told in the teachings of Jesus not to resist evil. We are to turn the other cheek. The world assumes that evil must be battled by every means available. We are told to love our enemies and bless them that curse us. The world assumes that friends are to be loved and enemies hated. We are told that the path and gate that lead to salvation are narrow. The world, wrapped in conformity, assumes that it is safest to follow the crowd. We are told to be as carefree as birds of the air and lilies of the field. The world assumes that we should take infinite care to build our security. Then he finishes by saying, H.G. Wells was evidently right. Either there was something mad about this man, or our hearts are still too small for what he was trying to say. I love
Great
that.
quote, isn't
It's
it?
so great because in each part, he contrasts the two worlds and finishes by saying, from our standpoint, this guy looks crazy, but maybe it's just because our hearts are still too small.
Yeah, and you look at Jesus and you think, what was so special about this guy? And it was this. He came into the world with a completely different set of values. He was in the the love column and he brought that here. But at the same time, look at what happened to him. Look what the world did to him.
Well, and even before we get there, I think we should point out that the Gospels report in several places that he was believed to be mad himself. This is not just H.G. Wells,
Mm.
talking from the 20th century. He, by his own contemporaries, was believed to be mad. There's a really significant passage in Mark. This is in chapter 3 of Mark. And it says, and when his family heard it, they went out to seize him, for people were saying he is out of his mind. And the scribes who came down from Jerusalem said, he is possessed by Beelzebul, and by the prince of demons, he casts out the demons. So we've got the scribes coming down from Jerusalem saying he's demon possessed, and we have his family. This is like Mother Mary This is like Brother James, who would become the leader of the Jerusalem church,
Hmm.
thinking we've got to grab this guy because he's out of his mind. That's not something we remember a lot about the Holy Family, but it's right there in Mark.
Yeah, isn't that interesting? I mean, the course paints this contrast between one person gains for when another person loses, and then, as you say in your notes here, this other choice of we gain together, love wins. Jesus comes in with the message of unconditional love,
Mm.
unconditionally loving, and even his family thinks he's insane.
Yeah.
What does that tell you about the insanity of the world? And you would think that we would have improved over the course of 2000 years, and we have, but not so much that we don't identify with the values of the world.
Oh, yeah. 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 So there is a distinct, as you were saying in our class, countercultural edge to these teachings. And you see it with Jesus. If you live out these teachings, if you are love based, that so goes against the societal norms and rules and structures that people will look at you and say, you're mad.
Right. And there's something in us that wants to look at Jesus and hold him up as an example and say, I want to bring those values in the world. I want to be a messenger of love the way that he was. And yet we also look at what happened to him and we fear that for ourselves. I love the line in your commentary on this section. It says, when pure love walked the earth, meaning Jesus, when pure love walked the earth in human form, the world crucified it. And we're afraid
Yeah,
of that.
right.
We're
We are
afraid
afraid of
that's what's
that.
going to happen to us. That if we come out in this pure conviction for love, that the world is going to judge us as insane, that we're going to do things that are against our self interest, things that are dangerous and naive, and we're going to pay the price for it. And so that's in us too.
Which shows that we see him as good and as ideal and inspiring, but not as sane,
Mm-hmm.
which is different.
And I think it has to be said too that Jesus's message of unconditional love for all and that you are holy just by virtue of the fact that God created you strikes up against that thing in us where our hearts are too small to take in his message, because there's still something in us that feels like we want to be holy because we've earned it. We want to be good because we've earned it. And in order for us to be good, someone else has to be bad, right?
Yeah.
And for
Yeah.
Jesus to come in and say, that's just not how love works, it goes against that thing in us that, again, wants to be on top.
Sure. And I think that's a lot of the conflict that he faced because he was breaking what Marcus Borg called the holiness code, where, there was a hierarchy of how high on the ladder you were in terms of holiness, depending upon how good your observance of the Jewish law was and the Jewish customs. And so the idea was he was breaking the code by associating with those who were called the sinners. They were non-observant. They weren't following the rules. And that threatened the whole system. Here's a holy man associating with the unholy. Um, so yeah, I do think that his life shows what we should be able to work out just from reading the course. And that is these teachings, they have social implications. If you really go out and act like this, you will be seen as mad. And to some degree, you will be seen as a threat to the system. Now, it may be that if you do a mild version of it, you can get along fine. But if you really go far with it like he did, then you come up against some problems. And one of the notable things about his life story in the Gospels is there's just continual conflict. He is in conflict all around, especially with the authorities, also with disciples who don't get him, but he's in conflict with those in power. And it starts at the beginning of the story and it goes all the way until he's crucified.
And his ministry was only about 3 years. So that
Well, according to
conflict.
John, it was. The impression you get from Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it was like 1 year.
Oh, wow. So conflict right from the beginning and snuffed out to rise again. So in the class, I know I was saying like, look what happened to him. And you were like, yes, but
Look what happened
let's
to
talk.
him.
Yeah, exactly. Look what happened to him. Let's talk about post-Easter Jesus. So
And post Good Friday Jesus.
right. So his message, he did go on. His message did go on. So when I said something to the effect of, you would think that the pure message would save the messenger, you were like, well, it did.
Yeah. And that, to me, that if we see the end of his life as resurrection, that's a very different meaning that we give to his life, because the idea is that by standing for love, unconditional love, he tapped into a power. And it's him tapping into that power that resulted in his resurrection.
Right. And so, what we do instead of tapping into that power, choosing love as the sane choice, we adjust to the world. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah. We wanted to bring in this other section, which is from a little ways earlier in chapter 20. And in the CE is called The Insanity of Adjustment. It's chapter 20, section 3. And the whole section is this kind of sweeping critique of the idea of adjustment. And to appreciate the section, you have to realize that adjustment, being well adjusted, is a high value in our culture, right? Being well adjusted appears to be the epitome of mental health. There's a dictionary definition I found that defines well adjusted as mentally and emotionally stable. But the course has a different perspective. That section says you make the world and then adjust to it and it to you. And it's a brief line, but it paints this whole picture. And the picture is we make the world by adjusting the original pristine reality that God created. So we make the world by distorting perfection. And then having made the world, we are in this we're in a friction with it where now we have to adjust to it or it's just going to step on us, right? And we have to do our best to adjust it to us, which we can do to some degree. We can control, our immediate environment to a certain amount. So we change the things we can to adjust them to us. We change ourselves to the extent that we can to adjust ourselves to the world. And then at the end of it all, we hope to be well adjusted and we think, I'm healthy. But if we have adjusted ourselves to an insane world, a world that is a distortion of original perfection, then we've just conformed to insanity. Right? So can that be? I mean, if we are perfectly adjusted, we just fall in line with the insane herd.
That is such an incredible section in the course and such an incredible point, because we do think that being quote unquote well adjusted is the height of sanity here. And what the course is saying is, do you want to be well adjusted to insanity and call that
Right.
sane?
Right. And when you think about it, the people who make a real difference, who change the world, they are those who refuse to adjust. And yeah, a lot of people refuse to adjust because they're more mentally ill than the rest of the world. Those are the people we think of when we think of those who never adjust. But there are those who are healthier, less mentally ill than the rest of the world. When they refuse to adjust, they change things.
Yeah, but it takes a certain amount of courage and a large amount of conviction to do that, because you're constantly swimming upstream against the values of the world. And as we were talking about this, and as I shared very briefly in the class. I discovered this about 2 years. Well, everyone discovers it throughout their life, but I really bumped up against it 2 years ago during my divorce when I was determined and my ex-husband was determined to go into the process with our attorney from a loving perspective. Like we were determined to come out of this process intact as a family, just dissolving the marriage. And so once the attorney got involved, it things changed. She was my attorney, so it was, you need to stand up for yourself, you need to get this, you need to make sure that you're taken care of for your, I mean, it was, and I understood where she was coming from. She was just doing her job, but at the same time, it was, her attitude was basically like, how far can you rake this guy over the coals to get what you need to survive? And it was gaining at his loss, right? And so, and she even turned it on me. And when I said, that's just not who we are, and that's not how I want to do things, she was like, well, you're not standing up for yourself, and made it a confidence issue about me. And
Right.
I remember I let that message in for a while, because her points were basically, you're not going to be taken care of in your retirement, and you're never going to make enough money working for a nonprofit, and like you just don't stand up for yourself, and you've historically done that in your career, like she knew. But I let that message in, and I was talking to you about it that same day, and you said something that I really appreciated. You were like, Emily, you're just bringing different values into this process. You've brought different values into your divorce process. You bring different values into your career. And you're not here to set yourself up for retirement, even though that's important. Don't get me wrong. But what's more important is the purpose, right? And so those are countercultural values. And so you have to arm, and I hate using this language, but you almost have to like arm yourself up when you go out into the world, because the world's going to tell you that the values of love are insane.
Right. Right. And that the big sin in this case was the sin against valuing yourself and standing up for yourself and getting everything you can because you're worth it. That's a value system. And it's contrary to the value system of love.
But you need people around you to reinforce this message. And what we tend to find is people around us who reinforce the message of the world.
Yeah.
So you're in my situation, your friends will say, yeah, girl, you get what you can. And you need someone to stand, and we need to be that for each other, to stand and say, you're here for something bigger, you're here for something different. And in this example, your attorney is going to go away in about 6 weeks, but that relationship that you have with your ex, that's going to be there for life because you share children.
Yeah.
And who is standing up for that message? Who's standing up for the we gain together message?
Yeah. And when you stand up for it, ripples do go out from your actions. I mean, look at the ripples that Jesus caused. They were tidal waves. He refused to adjust, thank God. He absolutely did not adjust, and he paid for it with his life. But I believe there was a resurrection, which does put a very different ending onto the story. It makes a very different statement about the outcome of refusing to adjust.
It's the ultimate love wins.
Yeah. Yeah. And then when we refuse to adjust in the name of real love, even if we do it in more private, modest ways, they're not extreme as his, ripples go out from that too.
Yeah, and it's those ripples went out, as you're saying, because he didn't adjust. What
Right.
if he had? Then he would be just like the rest of us.
Right. What if he'd
And
said,
where would we be then?
if I cut a deal with the Romans, I can retire in my own villa, and live out a comfortable life. I mean, where would the world be? So one of the things that came up for us that we shared about in the class was just how continually we stand before this issue. We know these choices. Even if we aren't facing them consciously, they're contending within us, and it's like they're tectonic plates that are rubbing against each other within us. And occasionally there's earthquakes that come from that inside of us. And, you know, there are times in our lives where we really stand before the two choices. And the choices come down to, I think, what we are familiar with. It's like, do we want to be loving, but does that mean we finish last? Is it suicidal? Is it insane? And
Are
then
people
we
going to
don't,
violate our boundaries?
are they going to violate our boundaries? We don't want to be aggressive and harsh and hurtful, but maybe that's the way to get ahead. And maybe that's what we have to do to protect ourselves. And so when you put it that way, I think you realize, yeah, it's not just every now and then. We're kind of facing that issue in mild forms, semi-consciously throughout the day, every day.
Yeah, it feels like it's just that software that's operating in the background all the time with us. We are constantly facing this choice between, are we going to adjust to the insanity of the world, or are we going to stand for love? And to me, it feels very much like a short game, long game thing. So Jesus lost in the short game.
Right.
Right. His ministry wasn't that long. But in the long game, look what he won. So the similar situation, like with the example from my life I'm just sharing, short term, did I get as much money as I could? Maybe not. But in the long game, I gained that I preserved that relationship. And
Yeah.
that's always going to be more important. And so it just feels like we have to face our choice between love and insanity at all times and be brave enough to make the right one.
Yeah. And I think that we are, some choices you spend a lot of time making. Like there are some times where, you decide to marry someone after standing before the question of, should I marry that person? Maybe for years, right? That happens. So this is one of those kind of choices where I think we're standing before it and taking a long time to decide, okay, I'm throwing all of my chips in on the side of love.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that we did in the class was we had people write down the people and the teachings and the experiences and the stories and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, that had given them evidence that love is actually sane, not just an ideal, but is sanity. And what came out of that was people had long lists. And I had a long list. There were individuals and there were teachings and there were experiences of mine and experiences of others. And there was guidance and there was like life lessons. Love works better. And you see that play out in 1,000 situations. And there was a whole big collection of things. And what I realized was this is a choice I am making with my life over a long period of time, drawing upon lots and lots of sources of support to support me in a choice that looks like a very hard choice.
Mm. Is there anything from that exercise that you feel like sharing from your own life where you've made a choice for love?
Well, I think that making the choice for love and seeing it work out is not so much, I'm sure I could think of individual instances, but it's more like seeing it work out better in thousands of instances, right? Where you just can feel like taking the loving path made everything go better. And I ended up happier and more peaceful. So that was one like pattern.
Can never get you to like drill down into specifics of your life. Here I am, like spilling my guts about my divorce, and you never quite go there with me.
I can't think of anything. Okay, I'm sorry. Anyway,
Silly.
So as I made my list, of course, Jesus is top of the list, and the course is the top of the list, but also innumerable instances of guidance, experiences I've had, experiences other people have had. We don't say in our mind, oh, that one thing happened, so I'm going to transfer all of my allegiance from the world over to the Holy Spirit's world and God's value system of love. No, we are making this choice through thousands of little choices and with tons of bits of support holding us up as we slowly make the choice.
Yeah, and one thing that this section goes on to say that I thought was pretty powerful is you really have to look at what your choices are costing you too. So when you understand the cost of the wrong choice, then you're
Right.
more willing to make the right choice. And when you realize that choosing the values of the world are costing you love, costing you relationships, costing you what is ultimately real, and you're choosing what is false instead, then you realize that cost is too high and
Yeah.
you're less willing to make it.
And I think that's a huge part of the process. That's a really good point. And as you pointed out, what the section says is until he realizes it cost him his sanity. Like all along, we're saying, okay, yeah, that didn't work out well. Yeah, that choice estranged me from this person and shattered the relationship. But we say, but I'm sane. I made the choice for sanity. And after all the cost adds up, at some point we say, no, all of this didn't help me keep my sanity. It cost me my sanity.
Mm. So it pays to not be well adjusted in this case.
Yeah, in this sense. I mean, you don't want to be like this, going out and I read an article where someone said, okay, I was born a sociopath. And when we were first married, my husband would be shocked when he'd find out I'd spent like a day in a stranger's house without their permission while they were not home. And he was shocked that I didn't care that I had done that. You don't want to be, poorly adjusted in that sense. You want to be, you want to refuse to adjust because your level of health is higher than the world's, not lower.
Yeah. Well, and as you're getting closer to that mindset of we gain together, then you're getting closer to the mindset of love.
Yeah.
It's not that I'm just going to break into a stranger's house. If you're getting closer to that mindset, you're not
Right.
quite as adjusted as we're talking about in this
Yeah.
podcast.
Right. Right. So there's almost like you need to go through a certain amount of adjustment first. And hopefully you keep going and you outpace the world. And then you stand for something higher, and then there's a way in which you are not adjusted. You refuse to adjust.
That is a gorgeous place to end, unless you feel like you want to say anything else.
I can't think of anything else to say.
It's a great topic, isn't
it's a
it?
great topic. And
Mm-hmm.
I feel like I hope we've expressed it in a way where everyone can connect with the fact that, yeah, they're standing before this choice too.
Yeah. So go out there and stand for something higher.
Yeah.
All
Amen to
right.
that.
Thank you, Robert.